The more layers we peel back about Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, the more disturbing this case becomes. Even though we know the gruesome details about the tragic loss of the lives of JJ and Tylee, more questions remain. The biggest one is, how could a mother do this to her children? And who was this co-conspirator who helped her? Well, today we are going to explore the deranged beliefs Chad Daybell and Lori had and try to discover what could make them possibly justify harming their own children. So sit back and try to relax, because it's time to take a deep breath and let the fresh air in. Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great day so far. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. So if you like stuff like this too, please subscribe to the channel. I would absolutely love to have you here. So Chad Daybell's trial started this week, and it brings up so many questions. And we all know how deluded Lori is, but now it's time to focus on Chad and uncover how he was able to influence Lori so much. Or was he even the one doing the influencing? So, we're going to take a trip down memory lane today and explore a number of religious and spiritual aspects of this case, from Chad's upbringing to Lori's dad's unique beliefs and a book he wrote, but more on that later. And we will break down a history of the more conservative branch of the Mormon religion. After all my research, I can tell you that the link from conservative or extreme Mormonism and political conservatism to this doomsday cult ideology is very, very strong. And it makes me think that perhaps Chad nor Lori influenced the other at all. In fact, maybe they had a toxic symbiotic relationship, much like when one throws gasoline on a fire. My resources will be in the pinned comment down below, but I wanted to shout out an incredible book that does exactly what I love, breaks down the beliefs, the history of the church, and how it influenced Chad and Lori's life. That book is When the Moon Turns to Blood by Leah Sotile. I hope I'm saying that right. It might be Sotil. But if you like this video and you want more, because trust me, there is way more, this is the book for you. I literally could not put it down. I read it right before bed. I do not recommend that because nightmares might follow you. So just be careful about that. If you're not familiar with this case, I highly recommend watching the Netflix docuseries Sins of Our Mother on Netflix, or one of the other awesome creators who have covered this case extensively, and I'll go ahead and list that in the description box. So watch that and then come back to this video. There's literally so much information on the internet regarding this case. There's so much covering Chad Daybell's trial right now that it was difficult for me to go back in time. So I really used that book to my advantage because it provided so much information. So do your own research, form your own opinions, and then hopefully you'll be super well prepared for this video because we are getting into the thick of it. So I want to start just before Lori and Chad met. Lori was married to a different man named Charles Vallow at the time. And Lori was a woman whose faith was a cornerstone of her life. She took it very seriously, and she felt like she had always had a divine, special connection to something bigger than herself. She also always felt like she had a bigger purpose in life. I mean, she was this beautiful blonde and never really seemed to be someone who ever had a bad day. Things just always seemed to work out for Lori until they didn't. Charles, however, was not so devout. He actually converted to Mormonism for Lori, but I'm not sure how strongly he practiced this faith, and so this was never going to be enough for Lori. She was an enlightened woman. She needed a man who was her spiritual equal. And Lori seems to be a woman of privilege. She usually got what she wanted. She was charming, beautiful, and seemed pretty outgoing. And it's difficult to pinpoint any area of her life where she might have had challenges or troubles. But what we know for certain about her is that she was borderline obsessed with her faith. And it was this blind faith that would lead her to kill her children. So, to truly understand how and why Lori seemed and continues to seem so steadfast and delusional in her faith, we need to take a look at her father. Barry Cox actually wrote a 421-page book called How the American Public Can Dismantle the IRS. So, if that doesn't give you a little preview of the kind of man we're talking about, I honestly don't know what will. He actually published this book the very same day the police knocked on Lori Vallow's door after not being able to contact her or find her missing children. Like 2019, the same day. So I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to you that Lori's father was very anti federal government. And he actually grew up very close to Glendale, California, where a group called, and I'm not making this up, Posse Comitatus was formed in the 1960s. I'm like, is this where the word posse came from? But I highly doubt it because this was a white supremacist group and they believed that the government was corrupt. Think modern day QAnon for Mormons, but back in the 1960s. They had a lot of the same similar beliefs. Posse comitatus, if I'm even saying that correctly, I apologize if I'm not, means power of the country. And they believed that the highest level of the government was the county sheriff, not anyone in your state government, not the federal government, because they thought that this was how they would keep the sheriff accountable to make sure that all of the individuals in the community were getting what they wanted. And they didn't want there to be a further hierarchy. They wanted the county sheriff to be the guy. Basically, they believed that the federal government should have absolutely no say in your life. They basically, and I quote, wanted to be free of all obligations to laws that they didn't like. And they wanted to be free of financial obligations as well, unquote. But what's very ironic is Barry was a devout Mormon. And as a Mormon, he was required to give 10% of his entire income to their church. So I guess a church tax is fine, but not the federal government. And I guess one could argue that the church is not a taxable entity anyways, so perhaps he justified it in that way. But I did think it was a little ironic. So, in the late 80s, Barry Cox had adopted these views, even though Posse Comitatus was no more. But Barry decided that he was just not going to pay his federal taxes. He ended up going to jail for his crimes and ended up owing the government over $200,000. But instead of paying the government and being like, okay, I know I did something wrong, he decided his best course of action was to not just sue the IRS, but also the U.S. Probation Office and the U.S. Department of Justice. And these were all thrown out, of course, but man, this guy had a pair on him, didn't he? But he was still no match for the federal government. He ended up having to sell his house and file bankruptcy. Even as recently as 2020, the Coxes have been trying to file lawsuits against the federal government. I mean, Barry calls the IRS a cabal and believes in classic QAnon conspiracy theories. And at this point, he is very headstrong about these beliefs. The man was more concerned about these beliefs than he was even finding his own grandchildren, as he and his wife never made a public statement about JJ and Tylee and where they were. So, how does this all tie into Mormonism? Well, according to a man named Edwin Rushton, he said that the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith Jr., told him about something called the White Horse Prophecy. The White Horse Prophecy stated that the U.S. Constitution would one day, or perhaps several times, be, quote, hanging on by a thread, unquote. And it would be the Mormons who would jump in and save the integrity of the document and thus the United States of America. You know, they'd save the day because they're better than everyone. And apparently, it's not a theory that the church itself recognizes, but a lot of fundamentalist Mormons, like Lori's father, have really, really grasped onto this idea almost desperately. I mean, Lori's father definitely thought that he was a white horse. So, when you combine strict Mormon ideology with a sheer disdain for the government, mixed with some conspiracy theories, and you see how firmly and passionately Barry promoted these beliefs as if they were gospel, it's kind of easy to see how Lori became so steadfast in her own beliefs. Furthermore, this disdain for the government doesn't seem to be just a dislike or even a mistrust. It seems to be as if people who subscribe to this anti government belief seem to think that they are above the government, as if they're the real authority and not the government, and no one should ever take the government seriously because they don't know what they're doing. So, when we look at Lori and her recent behavior in the courtroom, it's easy to see that she seems to still have this air about her. She knows more than you, she's smarter than you, and she's the one connected to Jesus, and she didn't do anything wrong because her children are happier now. I think it's also interesting to point out that this group, Posse Comitatus, considered themselves to be part of the Christian identity religion. And it's an interesting connection to another case I covered here. It's a very incredibly disturbing serial killer case. His name is Israel Keys. And his parents were also part of the Christian identity religion at one point. And the area connecting Idaho to Washington state was considered the new frontier for the racists at the time. And it was the new frontier for anti Semitic people. So it was like a double whammy. If you want some of the history of that, I do cover it in this video, but it's also detailing a serial killer. So if that's not your jam, totally understand. So back in the 80s, I believe, many people were moving to this new frontier. They were living off the grid, building their homes in the woods, collecting firearms, and preparing for the second coming or for when the government comes and attacks us all. All the things that we're seeing in this case, and we've seen too many times before. And Rexburg, Idaho, the city that the children's bodies were found in, was believed by Chad and Lori to be the next Jerusalem, the next holy place where everyone who is saved after the second coming would get to live. And I think there's just something that happens to the ego when you're so ingrained in a religion or a belief like this. We honestly see it time and time again on this channel. People seek enlightenment or connection to a higher power. And when they believe they've reached that enlightenment, they start to believe that they're better than everybody else who isn't seeking that enlightenment or following that guru, or in this case, communicating through the veil. The theme of being spiritual or religiously better than others seemed to follow Lori throughout her life and her relationships. I mean, she made multiple men convert to Mormonism before she would agree to marry them. And even when they did convert, she still felt like the spiritual authority in their house. She, like her father, wanted more of that connection with God. She believed she had a special connection, a special gift, and she wanted to nurture that connection. She began going deeper and deeper, reading books, getting more engrossed in near death experience literature, which was kind of booming at the time. And that seemed to be a gateway to the other side. Having a near death experience made you feel like you had something to look forward to and didn't have to fear death so much. And in doing so, she began seeking out someone who could be her spiritual equal. Because Charles wasn't going to do that. Charles wasn't like her father. He wasn't dogmatic or passionate about his beliefs, and that was the type of man Lori wanted. Because she began to believe that she would only get to the highest place in heaven if she was married to a man who was her spiritual equal. And soon enough, she would meet Chad Daybell at a Preparing the People Doomsday event, and her world would change. So now let's talk about Chad. Chad grew up in Springvale, Utah, the very place where Brigham Young, the second president of the LSD, told his followers to go and live among other Mormons. And this is yet another classic cult tactic, telling all of your followers to move to a single location and create a new community of like minded people there. I mean, we've seen the communes, we've seen what happened with the Branch Davidians, with David Koresh, we've seen what happens with the Jonestown Massacre. It is just never a good idea to uproot your entire life to go move in with your guru or to a community of like minded people. Whenever I hear that phrase, it's just like a glaring red flag to me anymore. But Springvale is where Chad grew up, in the center of Mormon culture. It's said that he grew up in a very patriarchal household, which isn't that surprising considering Mormonism is very patriarchal. According to his sister in law, who did an interview with Hidden True Crime, she shared that Chad never seemed to be scolded. It was like he could never do anything wrong. He was just never disciplined. Furthermore, it seems like his mother got the brunt of the bullying in the family. The kids made fun of her so much that Chad's sister in law became concerned about exposing her future children to that behavior, so she and her husband kind of separated from the family. It seemed like Chad was the golden Mormon boy. But there's no denying that he was still a little odd. It seemed that he had a weird fascination with death. His sister in law mentioned that his job as a grave digger, which just seems so ironic knowing what he did to those children now. His sister in law thinks that it shouldn't be considered so odd because for their community, it was a normal job for someone living in that area at the time, especially if they were Mormon. But Chad seemed to have a weird fascination with death itself. He would even complain about having to wait for grieving family members to stop crying around grave sites so he could fill the grave back up. It just seems really strange to me. I mean, isn't part of being a faithful man having empathy for others? He also exhibited really troubling behavior as a boy. In his own writings, he admits about having the urge to kill a bee. He said that he found it so satisfying that he just kept at it and he killed over 100 bees. He says he didn't stop until he heard a voice, which he believes was the voice of God. I mean, yeah, but wouldn't the voice of God also scream to you, like, hey, don't harm these children? Maybe stop murdering everyone around you? This makes me really concerned that if he and Lori hadn't been caught, it would have been a killing spree. Because it seems like he had an affinity for death, and it sounds like he enjoyed killing bees. And I haven't talked about this in a long time, but there is something called the McDonald triad. It's three behaviors that a child exhibits that could mean that they could become a criminal or even a serial killer. These are setting fire to objects or even committing arson, wetting the bed regularly, and of course, probably the most common one, harming animals. So, anytime I hear of a child hurting another living creature, whether it's a bee or an animal, I immediately think, okay, this kid clearly needs some help, and Chad Daybell clearly needed help. And considering he wrote about this in his own book, it seems like he didn't really hold much remorse for doing it. He was like, I was killing all these innocent creatures until God told me to stop. But then again, he was the Mormon golden boy. He could do no wrong. His fascination with death did not go unnoticed. One of his first books he wrote as a kid was called The Murder of Dr. J and His Assistant. Chad always loved writing, and he loved writing books for Mormons. He wrote for the BYU paper and even started writing novels at one point. He wrote a lot of fiction books, as well as nonfiction books and even memoirs. And some people speculate that he kind of blurred the line between nonfiction and fiction. It just seems some of these things are a little too strange to be true. But we'll get into that very soon. When he worked with a paper, he even got to interview an author who had written a book on near death experiences and shared how that experience guided her back to her Mormon faith, implying that it was the one true religion. And they also joked that books about near death experiences are, for lack of a better word, basically a cash cow. And it seems like they are. I mean, there's a whole like subculture or niche of people who love near death experience or NDE books. I mean, I've read a few myself. Some have sold millions of copies. And when you start wondering, well, why is that? It's because the idea is comforting to have some proof of safety and security or understanding in the afterlife. And I speculate that Chad knew that if he started writing about near death experiences, he would make a lot more money, especially if he tailored it to his spiritual community. But for Chad, he framed it as his now connection to the other side of the veil. After his two near death experiences, he would claim that he was now directly linked to other spirits, angels, or perhaps even God himself. Now, it's debated on whether Chad's books told the truth or not, but he does claim to have two near death experiences. And in that space, the space between our real life now and the afterlife, is where Chad just gets to live now forever. Now he can determine who is good and evil, and he's essentially become a prophet, channeling direct messages from God, providing directives for others on how to live their life, and how to prepare for the second coming, where only the best of the best will survive and get to live in that new kingdom that, conveniently for Chad, would be located in Rexburg, Idaho. And the thing about doomsday prepping, too, is there's this fear ingrained that if you're not prepared enough, you won't make it. So there's constant purchasing, researching, reading these books, going to these conferences, trying to figure out the best way to prepare because you want to be saved, you want to be ready. And Chad believed he was ready. He was the most enlightened. He had a direct path to God. And part of his responsibility of being this close to God would be helping release all of the souls trapped inside evil entities. And he began to believe that death in this physical life doesn't matter, because death is the true path to save those souls. In the Mormon religion, it's okay to have personal revelations. These are personal messages that God sends directly to you, as if he is speaking to you. But in order to preserve the integrity of the church, you aren't supposed to share those revelations publicly with anyone because only the president of the church has a true, real link to God. So only the president, who has always been a man, by the way, I'm pretty sure, in the entire pyramid of elders and higher ups at this church, it's always been men and is currently men, but I digress. But if people are having these personal revelations and sharing them, they could be mistook for prophets. But Chad didn't care. He was going to share his revelations because he believed he had this link directly to God and the angels. And soon he would meet a woman who felt the same way. Lori Vallow began claiming that she too had had a near death experience. How convenient. She shared her story on the Preparing a People podcast. She claimed that while she was giving birth, she floated up above herself and Angel Moroni, the very angel who told Mormon founder Joseph Smith Jr. that he was the chosen one and he should create the Mormon religion. Again, how convenient. Yeah, she had a direct link to Angel Moroni and hence the spirit world. So she was better than the other Mormons. She knew more. She believed that killing her children would mean saving them from end times. And as we've seen, she still believes this delusion to this day. But all of this brings me to the doomsday aspect of this case. Everything I've talked about so far leads to this: the biggest question that everyone has had on their minds since the very beginning of learning about this case. How could someone do this to anyone, let alone your own child? And not just that, and then go on about life seeming to be joyous and happy. It's despicable, it's shameful, it's sad, and there is truly a special place in hell waiting for Lori and Chad. But how did these beliefs get so extreme? Well, to even begin to attempt to answer that question, we have to go back to the early 1900s and talk about a beet farmer named Ezra Taft Benson. And honestly, when I read that, I was like, all I can visualize right now is Dwight Schrute. So, this guy Benson, he also loved Idaho. He believed it was the promised land, just one racist, anti Semitic promised land. And he too was a writer for the Mormon audience. So, you can't help but wonder, did Chad idolize this guy in some way? Wouldn't surprise me. So Benson wanted to pave the way for LDS literature, and he believed that these writers could be stars. And he was also a farmer and a very passionate one at that. He wanted farmers to thrive, and he's even credited as being a marketing genius for what he did for the potato. I mean, Idaho basically became famous for potatoes, mostly thanks to Benson. But when Franklin D. Roosevelt shared the Agricultural Adjustment Act, that would raise prices on farmers' goods, and Benson decided that he needed to get more politically involved because that was not going to fly while he was around. Because of the LDS ideology that they all had to remain independent and never be in debt to anyone, mixed with Benson's passion for farmers and advocating for their rights, he knew that he just had to get more involved. And it was thanks to this advocacy that he began to make a name for himself. And almost 20 years later, Dwight D. Eisenhower would offer Benson a role in his cabinet as Secretary of Agriculture. And upon approval from the church, he would accept because he was also serving the church full time at that time. He seemed to get along really well with the president, but when he left that position, things really began to take a turn. And he started spouting anti government rhetoric among the members of the Mormon community. Benson was an apostle of the church, and he would often spread conspiracy theories during speeches, and he would incite fear about communists infiltrating the government. I mean, he started making up really crazy stories about how Roosevelt was trying to help the communists. It just sounded really crazy. I mean, in the book, the author even compared this guy to Trump, just like completely unfounded rhetoric and claims and attacks on other political figures. I mean, yeah, sounds pretty familiar. And Benson was someone who really started pushing this apocalyptic ideology, this fear that we all had to be preparing for the second coming that could potentially be violent, mixed with the communistic threat facing our nation. It would essentially and effectively wipe out everyone who wasn't purely devoted to God and the United States of America. So, this brings me to the idea of the chosen 144,000. These are the people who are given power to help bring people to salvation during the second coming. And it's pretty clear that Lori and Chad believed that they had that authority. They got to play God now and clear the earth of anyone or anything who stood in their way. It reminds me of Scientology believing that there are like these negative bodies all over you, like these little negative energies all over you, and you have to spend time and money in Scientology in order to get them all out of your system. It's what they call clearing the planet. This whole thing is eerily similar to that to me. When Chad met Lori at that Preparing a People conference, he felt an immediate connection to her, one that could only be explained because they obviously had multiple connections over multiple lives, right? Once again, how convenient. He convinced himself and her that they had been married over several past lives. Since he had written a book where the things that he discussed in that book had seemed to come true, he believed that he was a seer, that a voice, that same voice that told him to stop with the bees, was always guiding him and giving him visions. And since Lori read his book and several others, she believed everything he said and she believed in him. I mean, he was basically a celebrity within the Mormon community. Plus, he was telling her that she was an angel, and in their past lives they had been married, and all of their friends had been saints and angels, and they witnessed Jesus' crucifixion. So obviously, this meant that she had finally found her spiritual equal, and anyone who stood in her way of being with him would have to be eliminated. And at this point, to her, that's God's way. And this brings me to biases I'm seeing because I always try to understand what's like psychologically happening in a situation like this, not just, oh, this was their religion, it was what they believed. But when we look at the psychology of the situation, I kind of think it's a combination of two different kinds of biases. So we have confirmation bias, which we've talked about a lot. But if you don't know, I'm going to read the definition for you and I'll pop it up on the screen. The confirmation bias is the tendency to listen more often to information that confirms our own existing beliefs. Through this bias, people tend to favor information that reinforces the things they already think or believe. Examples include only paying attention to information that confirms your beliefs about issues such as control and global warming, only following people on social media who share your viewpoints, choosing news sources that present stories that support your views, refusing to listen to the opposite side or an opposing side, I want to add, not considering all of the facts in a logical and rational manner. This article goes on to say there are a few reasons why this happens. One is that only seeking to confirm existing opinions helps limit mental resources we need to use to make decisions. It also helps protect self esteem by making people feel like their beliefs are accurate. People on two sides of an issue can listen to the same story and walk away with different interpretations that they feel validates their existing point of view. This is often indicative that the confirmation bias is working to bias their opinions. And I'd like to introduce a new bias that even I just learned about called the hindsight bias, which I think is playing a part here because if you're reading a book and you are fearful of a prophecy coming true and then you see something in your real life that feels kind of similar to that and you connect the two and you're like they told the truth, this was the prophecy. This hindsight bias kind of reinforces why that's a bias and not necessarily a true prophecy coming true. The hindsight bias is a common cognitive bias that involves the tendency to see events, even random ones, as more predictable than they are. It's also commonly referred to as the I knew it all along phenomenon. Some examples of the hindsight bias include insisting that you knew who was going to win a football game once the event is over, believing that you knew all along that one political candidate was going to win the election, saying that you knew you weren't going to win after losing a coin flip with a friend, looking back on an exam and thinking that you knew the answers to the questions that you missed. I've totally done that before. Believing you could have predicted which stocks would become profitable, believing you predicted a cataclysmic event in a nonfiction book. It's a little too much to really like wrap your brain around, right? The hindsight bias occurs for a combination of reasons, including our ability to misremember previous predictions, our tendency to view events as inevitable, and our tendency to believe we could have foreseen certain events. The effect of this bias is that it causes us to overestimate our ability to predict events. This can sometimes lead people to take unwise risks. Need I say more? It's just the reality of like what happened and how nothing clicked in Lori's brain or even Chad's brain that this was the worst thing they could possibly do. Even after all of my research, because I just am so desperate to understand why when things like this happen. And it's still inexplainable to me. Researching things like this helps, and making videos like this helps, and I hope it helps you. But it's so hard to believe still. It's just so tragic that this happened. And it's disgusting how we've seen Lori act. It's despicable. It makes me absolutely sick. So we have Chad detailing all of his new visions or ideas or voices he's hearing to Lori via email. And this is when he shares with her that humans can be measured on a lightness scale. Based off of how many lives you've had, you're either a dark or a light entity. And if you were dark, that meant that that entity was taking over your physical form. You were a zombie, as they like to call it. And Chad and Lori's new role in preparing for a second coming would be to rid the world of all the dark entities and saving those souls. And to us, this all sounds insane, right? This sounds crazy. But if you've been brought up with this deep distrust of the government and you believe that you are a chosen person. I mean, the root of Mormonism is that you are a chosen person here to kind of correct everyone else and bring them into your religion. And based off of the White Horse prophecy, that will help save the Constitution and the government and order as a whole. So you're believing you're so special, you're so important. You believe you're better than anyone, you believe you're a chosen one, and this has been reinforced to you by people who you look up to, and now people are starting to look up to you and listen to you, and you're getting like drunk with this power. We have to remember that all of this started, these strange beliefs are all rooted in a very conservative, fundamental Mormon upbringing with a deep seated fear of society as a whole and government. So, when you're already ingrained in these extreme beliefs, it's easier to see how one might go even further into those beliefs. It's still shocking, it's still disgusting, it's still utterly horrifying. But it's not just like Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell woke up one day and thought, oh, I know who evil spirits are. This has been slowly ingrained in them subconsciously by people that they loved and trusted who would have disowned them, people who would never have believed this would have happened. And it all leads to this terrible outcome. It just gets more and more extreme. That's why these extreme beliefs are so dangerous. And on top of that, you're finding a community of people on websites like Preparing a People and Avow, which is a preppers website. It's another voice of warning. It's like a very popular preppers website. And if you recognize the name Julie Rowe, she's a big figure among preppers, as someone who is constantly pushing this ideology. I mean, she also claims to be clairvoyant and all of that. And I think she's Mormon too, but let me know if you want me to do a deep dive into preppers because that would be its own video. But you also have this now online community of people who are starting to look up to you if you're Chad Daybell. So you're starting to get this power, and everyone you're surrounding yourself with believes the same thing that you're believing, as wild as it sounds. So let's jump back to where Lori and Chad meet. After that preppers conference, Lori returns home and becomes obsessed with her faith. I mean, spending 8 hours a day at temple, speaking with women's groups about prepping. I mean, when we talk about time control and the bite model, she was literally putting all of her physical, mental, spiritual effort into this prepper ideology. And the closer she felt to God, the more these ideas of her being a chosen one began to take root. She even started telling people that she had witnessed Jesus' crucifixion. I just can't imagine being there and hearing her say that and being like, yeah, wow, that makes total sense. I'd be like, what the are you talking about? But Lori thought that all of this meant that God was calling the 144,000 people. These people would be the ones to survive the destruction of the world and rebuild it. And she and Chad were part of that. That was their mission, clearing the planet of any dark negative entity so that those people could be reborn into this Zion. But not only was this their mission, they believed that they were the leaders of the 144,000. They were getting to essentially choose their warriors who would survive to see that new Zion that would be created in Rexburg. Rexburg, just like what? And guess who would be invited? Only those light spirits or those dark spirits who were now killed and saved and would be reborn into this new city. Chad and Lori believed their perfect practices of spirituality and connections beyond the veil increased their vibrations. And because of that, they didn't need to follow any teaching of LSD anymore. Now they would and could prophetize if they wanted to, and they would share their gifts openly and publicly with people. They were what they called translated beings. So they basically were not even human. They didn't need food or sleep anymore. They were high vibrational. And I feel like we just hear this every time a cult is created. There's like this weird demonization of just being a human. And if you need these basic human necessities, you're somehow less than. You're less pure, you're less holy, you're less enlightened. And as for the light versus dark entities or zombies, this is another classic cult tactic because it creates an us versus them mentality. Nothing a zombie says is true because they're just dark entities serving Satan. And anyone who questions Chad or Lori or stands in their way, well, now they're dark entities. They're zombies because they're questioning the two translated beings. They're questioning the leaders of the 144,000. When we start asking the question again, how could a mother do this? We have to remember the delusion and the false reality that Chad and Lori had created around themselves. It seemed that anyone who questioned them, pointed out flaws in what they said or did, pushed back against them, or created an obstacle for these two to be together, that person was dark, a zombie, evil. Lori's husband, Chad's wife, they were obstacles, and they were deemed as dark entities. Tylee was a reminder of an ex-husband. She had to be a dark entity. And JJ, who knows why he became dark suddenly, but it just seemed like Lori never really wanted to truly be his mother. There have been sources that have come out and said that she expressed how difficult it was. And I think it was only difficult because she was trying to be separate from Charles. She wanted her own life, and she saw her own child as an obstacle to that. Lori had become so obsessed with emulating this fictitious and sometimes even rejected Mormon figure known as the Mother that she separated herself from her very real role in this very real reality as a mother to her two children. Like with any cult, it is in that separation that bad things happen. And the fact that these two children were murdered by their own mother and her deranged lover is more heartbreaking than I even have words for. A constant debate online about this case is who is really at fault here. Did Chad influence Lori, or was it the other way around? Now, people have differing opinions on who the real cult leader was here, but after all of this information, I actually have a different point of view. What these two monsters really wanted was to be the leaders of their own cult. They wanted to operate that group outside the confines of government, law, Mormonism, outside what we all considered right and wrong, because they believed that they were God's chosen people who were meant to gather the most holy people on planet Earth to create their new Zion in Rexburg, Idaho. They wanted a following of people who never questioned them, never considered that they could ever be wrong or misguided. It's like I said at the beginning, and like so many before me have said, Lori was the fire and Chad was the gasoline, and the combination was explosive. These two people were hungry for power, salvation, and no doubt money. It takes a special kind of deranged, evil person to murder your spouse and get remarried a couple weeks after that, or to spread Jesus's love on a podcast while your hands are still dirty from trying to bury children. And it takes a absolutely disgusting, deranged person to sit in a courtroom and claim that the children they killed are happy in heaven because they still come back and speak to you. They influenced each other. And the years of extreme beliefs that had primed their minds just allowed them to go more and more extreme. In my opinion, it's all a symptom. Each thing that happened is a symptom of what happened before it. You have extreme Mormonism, extreme hatred for the government, extreme patriotism, extreme fundamentalism, extreme spiritualism. It's all a gateway to tragedy. And I hope that moving forward, we can all begin to see these signs sooner before another tragedy occurs. Nothing will excuse what happened to those children and to Charles and Tammy and even Alex. No God would have wanted this to happen. I hope there comes a day when Lori and Chad are both able to really look at what they've done and feel the pain that so many of us have felt for their victims. But after seeing how they behave in the courtroom, I honestly don't have any faith that that will happen. That was a lot to take in, everyone. And honestly, there's so much more. It goes so much deeper. There's so much more we could cover. But I hope that you can read When the Moon Turns to Blood. It's so fascinating. And if you're a religious history nerd like me, you'll really get to see how in depth she goes. She does a fantastic job. She was my major resource for this video, so please go support her work. You can get it on Amazon if you'd like. I hope this video helps you understand more about something that's so ununderstandable. I know for me, in so many of these videos, I'm just like desperately seeking out understanding. And so often I'm left with just more questions. And that's what happened here yet again. But in a way, it does help me realize and recognize that just because you grow up living a certain way or believing in a certain thing doesn't mean you shouldn't look for other new information or embrace other ways of life. In fact, I'd say it's imperative to humans to explore other cultures, to explore ways of life other than our own, so we don't just get stuck in a silo or in an echo chamber of one singular way of thinking, because that always leads down a dangerous road. I want to say thank you all so much for watching today, and please stay safe out there. Always ask questions and stay skeptical. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and until next time, bye.